This is Tuesday, October 24th, 1989. This is Maurice Hamovitch, and I have the privilege of interviewing Frances Feldman in connection with the California Social Welfare Archives in order to learn about Frances from herself, about her experiences in social work in California. Frances, let me start with asking you if you could tell us when and why you first became interested in social work.
I became interested in the summer of 1934 when a friend who'd been a pre-medical student with me, and we were both supposed to go into medical school in September, called to tell me if I took off my lipstick and put on some glasses and went to see a particular woman at such and such an address, she would give me a job as a social worker to carry me through the summer. I didn't know what a social worker was. He explained that as somebody who works for the city or the state or the county, this was a state agency, and they help people. So I went down to get such a job, and because I had a bachelor's degree, which was all that was needed.
What was your bachelor's degree? What was your major?
My major was in chemistry. Actually, I had two majors because I'd been interested in literature. Mm-hmm. So I had worked in a literature major as well with my chemistry major. The chemistry, you had to have either chemistry or zoology to complete the pre-medical as a requirement for admission to the medical school.
Yeah, and you were admitted to the medical school at this point.
Yes, I was definitely to go in September, and I was admitted as one of 4 girls. They had decided on for the largest number the USC medical school that had. Sometimes they had none, and sometimes they had 1 or 2. But 4 would be a neat number to handle an anatomy table and fill one cadaver. I got the job as a social worker, never went back to medical school, and heard about it for most of the rest of my life, because one of the other 3 girls became my sister-in-law, and one of the others became my child's pediatrician. So they were always reminded.
Now, your brothers, what did they think about your leaving the field before you entered it?
Disappointed. The youngest of my brothers, Max, kind of liked the idea, though he was disappointed. Some years later, when Al and I went to Chicago so that we could take what we thought was an educational vacation for 1 year, my brother Jack was still saying, listen, it's not too late. They'll take you into the medical school. So he still had that idea for the rest of his life. I should go into medicine. But for me, it was right not to.
Obviously, for the field, it was right for you not to. Another question, why did this friend tell you that you should take off your lipstick and put on glasses?
I think that was a stereotype of the day, that social workers were frumpy women, not men ever, but frumpy women with petticoats showing below the hem of the skirt. And a frumpy woman would wear glasses, which I didn't own yet at that time, and certainly would never wear lipstick.
Well, when you got the job and you worked there for a while, did you find the stereotype was accurate in the most cases?
No, absolutely not. There were a lot of young women and young men at the time, all really very excited over this new program, which was one of the first of the Roosevelt programs, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and imbued with great excitement about what we could do. There were some frumpy women and frumpy men, but really for the most part they were just normally dressed people with the usual facade that you saw among young people everywhere then.
Well, let's see, what do I want to ask you? What was your experience? Now, you say you got the job, but what went on, and what did you find, and what made you, did you find that you wanted to run away at first when you saw what you saw?
No, it really was very exciting. I started with a handicap because the condition of my having the job was knowing how to drive, and I didn't know how to drive. So that the afternoon that I got the job, I called my brother, who was working as a librarian while he was going to medical school. And he came rushing home with the car and showed me how to drive, took me down to the motor vehicles office, which is the same one that still exists at 32nd and Hope. And I took a test and passed, not because I was skilled, but you didn't have to have a written examination then. A tester took you out for a field test. He asked me where I came from, and then he found I was born in Philadelphia, and he was too. I don't think he noticed any of my many mistakes, and I got a license. And the next morning, Al, who was courting me, came over in his car and followed me to a point on North Broadway where this man, who became a well-known orthopedist, who had told me about the job, followed me to this new office. And when I got there, it was chaotic. Harry Hopkins had stipulated that in order to keep politics out of the welfare program, there had to be a trained social worker in every office. And there was one here. The director was a trained social worker from the New York school. And she had so many people starting and so many demands for help. There was a railroad strike, and all the conductors, everybody who worked on the Los Angeles city lines, as well as the interstate transportation, was on strike, and they had been for a number of months. So they were having a great deal of difficulty. And this was also the time when Harry Hopkins said, "We will not aid strikers, but we will aid their families." And so the families were to be helped. This woman, Alice Orange, was the director, handed me a grocery order and said, "Deliver it." And I didn't know what to do with the grocery order. He said, "Well, I'll tell you on the back, but my first task was to get myself and my car to the address," which turned out to be on Mount Washington.
Where did you get a car?
It was a family car. My brother just went to school and worked on a streetcar, and I had the car. It was a hand-me-down, which we had acquired from my brother Jack, who had finished medical school and who he was interning at that point. And he was earning $10 a month. And with that $10 a month, because he had room and board as an intern, and he was married, and his wife was the school teacher, they had bought a new car, and Matt and I acquired the old car. So that was, I think, probably a pretty normal way of acquiring things in the Depression period. But I sat outside this house, which I reached at the top of the hill, and the street ended there. There was just fields on the other side. And I began to read the instructions and fine print on the back, and a car pulled up behind me, and the woman, Harriet Edinger, came out and said, she'd seen me in the office, that I know what to do with that. And I didn't. So she explained, she gave me my first introduction to how you know whether a family is in need and how you get them to tell you that their problems are. And this was a railroad family. She had had some 10 years of experience. She's worked in the county program. And about 10 years later, she was working for me. And I had never forgotten her kindness in following me, because I obviously didn't know what I was doing. And then having had the help of the family in how to handle this, they didn't know either. We read the instructions together. And then he kept in touch with me for a long time afterwards. He would send me postcards and told me that the man got a job, although I had no further responsibility. But that was a really very auspicious beginning. Then I worked my way around in my car, around the top of the hill, and then down the street with one foot on the clutch and one on the brake, not knowing that if you stepped on the clutch, you rolled. And I came to a miraculous stop at the bottom of the hill, which later I discovered was a 33% grade. But I never had any fears about driving after that. That was quite an indoctrination.
Well, if you got past that, you can get past anything.
And I didn't have any anxieties about interviewing after that first experience. But it was very exciting because you have such visible evidence that you were being helpful. And Al was courting me. He'd walk 4 miles to my house every night. 4 miles. He was a research chemist. He'd come out of Johns Hopkins with a degree and gotten a job, but as a chemist they were working only 2 or 3 days a week. Research chemistry didn't have the aura that it had in later years. I would tell him about my clients. He said he wondered if he could get a job like that. Went down and got one. And he became a social worker. Never left with either. So for both of us, it was really the right place.
Well, then what happened after that? That was 1934.
Well, actually, I got fired.
You did?
Yes. I began on June 21st, and I was fired on November 1st because somebody discovered I wasn't 21. I could not legally sign documents. And so I was referred to the Torrance Recreation Department, where they had some federal money for storytellers. And I worked as a storyteller on the playgrounds in Torrance until my birthday on December 3rd, when I was notified to come back to work. So I returned to state relief administration after, I think it was about 5 weeks as a storyteller. That's the only time in my life I've been fired. But it wasn't really my first experience as a storyteller, although I didn't remember this until just a couple of years ago. When we came to California, I was 8, and my second day in California, my brother had discovered the public library and the Museum of Natural History. And so we spent a lot of time in both of those. The librarian at the Vermont Square Library suggested that I could spend my Saturdays very productively if I were to read to children in the orthopedic hospital or tell them stories. And so I began as a storyteller at the orthopedic hospital. And I sometimes wonder that my mother allowed me to take a streetcar when I was 8 years old to the orthopedic hospital, which was quite some distance from where we lived, but it also tells you how different Los Angeles was in 1921. And so I did that all through elementary school. I went to the orthopedic hospital. When I started in junior high school, I stopped doing that because my schedule. I don't remember really why I did it, but it didn't work out.
So you did have some background.
I had some background.
Well then, okay, when you got rehired.
When I got rehired.
And what did you do, and how long was it before you began to be interested in getting graduate social work education?
Well, actually, I had begun to feel a need to have some more systematic understanding of what I was doing about human behavior. You know, you learn a great deal from English literature. To be sure, not from chemistry. But my interest in behavior in different time periods and how the environment influenced that really stood me in very good stead in understanding some of the things that I was seeing. But I missed having a systematic understanding. And so I began to take courses at USC, which offered a program. Actually, what there was a Master of Science in Social Work, which was under the auspices of the Department of Sociology, Belvedere School, Social Work. And I took courses in interviewing in research where I really didn't learn anything because the research professor was not interested in that. He was interested in research, but not in the teaching of it. And I took courses in race relations from Emily Bogart, who was very interested at that time, and also was developing his theory of social districts at the time. And we became very good friends around the work he was doing in race relations and social distance. And I completed pretty much through those years the first year of work, with the exception of field work. Al and I had decided that it was, we had been married now for several years, that it was time for me to leave and really approach this whole field more systematically. I would be first and then he would be second, and that's the way it worked out. He continued to work while I went to school. Arlene Johnson was coming to start the MSW program. Ruby Inlow had come that summer of 1939 as a consultant to Family Service of Los Angeles. And so I had a field placement through that summer and officially completed a full first year of work with Ruby as my field instructor. And then in September came back to school for the second year. I was one of the 4 people who were in the second year program.
How many were in the first year?
Well, there were not. They
started the second
they
year.
Were. We were the only ones in the second year. There hadn't been a first year except for people who, like myself, had been taking part-time work. And I don't remember how many students there were formally in the first year. There couldn't have been very many because I got my MSW as one of these 4 in June of 1940. Al got his MSW the following year, and he was the only graduate that year. And he had seriously thought about not going to commencement exercises, which were at the Coliseum, really in those beds, but it was going to be up to her to call on the graduates, and if he weren't there, she would have no one to stand up. And so he went to the commencement. But I don't know how many students there were. He finished writing his thesis, and this was something that was very difficult for many students to do. So many caught up over the years. And I think there were quite a few people who were students, but I don't know how many graduates.
So you graduated in 1940.
1940.
And then when did Al start then?
Well, Al had been taking courses part-time.
Oh, he had also.
Sometimes we were in the same classes and sometimes not. But he had completed a full first year with the exception of field work. And then in the summer of, I guess the same summer, he began to do field work in the research department at the Gulfer Planning Council. And the next year they hired him, and he went to work there. And he worked there part-time while he was going to school full-time. So that when he finished in 1941, he became a full-time worker in the research department.
So he started there all the way back then.
Yes. And he was there until he went into military service in March of 1942. Pearl Harbor was in 41. December of 41, March of 42. And then when he finished his military service at the end of 45, he went back to the planning council.
Then in the meantime, after you graduated, what did you do?
Well, after I graduated, I had...
But you working, you quit your job in order to...
Yeah, I had quit, and I had quit at a really very good time because a lot of political manipulations had begun to take place. Hopkins' idea of having social workers in order to prevent politicizing the department had now fallen by the way. And in almost every office through the state, the people who were operating, who were the administrators, were people who'd come out of military service, retired people, or other people who had had important political positions. And so they were now running the state relief administration. Elle and I had married only with the knowledge of all our relatives and friends, but not official. Then I was still in the state relief administration because Charles Shotman, who was the state director, and George Nichol, who was the state director of social services, felt that there would be a time when nepotism would be an ugly word. And Charles had told Al he thought we should not make any official announcement of this, and so we didn't. We announced it. In fact, we got married again in Los Angeles. Then I left in the agency. So it would appear, then all marriages were recorded in the press. And so it would appear officially in the press. So we were married twice. And shortly after I left, nepotism did become a very significant term. With Milton Chernin, who was then working in public administration, married to a social worker, and at a large community meeting he said, who would marry a social worker but another social worker? And he thought this was unrealistic not to think of social workers being married to each other and working in the same organization. But we escaped all the hassle of that because I had already met. I hadn't foreseen this. I simply taken Charles Shotton's word for it. But he was a good prognosticator.
Yeah. So he was director more than once.
Yes, he was director of the State Relief Administration, and then he went into private practice of law. Then he headed up the Jewish Welfare Federation in Los Angeles, and from that he was persuaded to become the director of the State Department of Social Welfare, following Martha Chickering and Al Wollenberg. Martha Chickering was a social worker, but Wollenberg was a political appointee. So Charles came in really to reorganize the state.
That's fascinating. And George Nickel, excuse me. I'm sorry, there was a pause there. I wanted to get back to it. So the other one was George Nickel, who ran the Social Service Division.
Social Services for the State Relief Administration. He was an early graduate of university, I think 1926. But while I was in the State Relief Administration, I had been a caseworker for less than a year, and then was made a supervisor, and then was moved up to the next level, which was intake supervisor. And my task there, aside from supervising supervisors and staff intake, the officers were gigantic. Factories, really. My recurring responsibility was to meet every week with representatives of the County Welfare Department, which was then the Bureau of English Country Youth. Incidentally, it became that name until I went there some years later as a district director and persuaded the superintendent of charities that was a terrible name. And he got the county charter changed.
Is that right?
And it became then the Department of Public Assistance. Now, of course, it's been changed again. But we got that word indigent out of it, which was one of my first successes in public welfare. But as an intake supervisor, I would meet every week with the representatives of the public county agency. Their responsibility was to give help to people who were indigent in terms of poor relief, unemployable. They also administered the old age assistance programming, the aid to the blind, and the beginning of aid to dependent children. There were no federal funds. So it was pretty well divided between state and county, with all non-categorical aid funds coming out of the general county taxes. Their charge was to keep the caseload down and to take only those people who truly, reminiscent of Mr. Lee, truly were unemployable. The State Relief Administration could not aid people who were not employable. And this was a very serious problem because many people had worked into their 80s before the Depression struck and had never thought of themselves as anything but employable. And now the likelihood of their ever being back in the labor force was very small. But to persuade the county to take them was a never-ending task and negotiation, because otherwise they would be left between agencies. We had very few voluntary agencies at the time that were prepared to give any assistance. Salvation Army in certain parts of the city, Volunteers of America and certain others, but not what's available. And so this was a major thing that I did until I left in 1939.
Okay, so then you went to school, you got your degree, and then you went. Did you go back?
Then I got a job. In fact, I think that Arlene Johnson referred me to it, or it to me, I think is the way it went. The United Way, then the Community Chest, was having some trouble raising its own needed funds. And the board of directors had decided it was important to see whether any of the agencies that were in membership with Community Chest were actually aiding people who should be aided by the public agencies. And so they conducted a study known as the Lomas study, because Lomas was the man who is still on the board, as far as I know.
How do you spell that name?
Loebeke. And he provided funds himself for this study because the community trust didn't have it. And so I worked for 3 months doing that study, which for me was a very valuable experience, because I went to every agency that had any kinds of funds from the community chest and examined their intake policies.
So this time your driving skills made it possible to drive all over the place.
Yes, it was a great help. I knew how to find my way around Los Angeles. And at that time, the community chest covered only Los Angeles and none of the other outlying towns. But Los Angeles was pretty big because San Pedro was part of it, and Lancaster was part of it. So it was a gigantic area without any of these now incorporated towns as part of it. But it was a fascinating experience because I learned things about not only the way agencies operated, but also why the community chest gave money to some, where you really saw no function that would be connected with helping people. But because they'd always given it, and because somebody on the board of that agency was very influential with the community chest, and you saw agencies that really needed a lot more help, but they were limited in what was available because the total goal of the community chest was pretty low. And you saw behaviors among agencies that made you wonder. One, for example, was a mission in San Pedro. I've forgotten what the name of it is, and I don't know whether it even still exists, but it primarily served sailors. They were all John Does. They all had to go to church services before they could have breakfast, or before they had lunch, or before they had a bed at night. But the director was very conscientious about clearing every one of those with the social service chain to see if any other agency was giving them any help. So he'd clear all these John Does with the social services chain. He'd get back these little yellow slips showing that there were no other agencies involved. And at one point, he had about 80 John Does none of them having had services elsewhere, all of them seamen. Al was at this time still with, had just gone to the research division of the Planning Council. And I'd been telling him about this mission, and he became interested in how agencies use the social services change. And that eventually led to the discontinuance of the social services change as a cost that had no justification, no service connected with them. But after that Lomas study, Arlene Johnson prevailed on me to go to the Los Angeles City Housing Authority. In 1939, the Federal Housing Administration, that's not quite its name, but it was the first slum clearance program under federal auspices had been established. Los Angeles City was one of the first to establish an authority and to set up a program for slum clearance and construction of public housing. And I became director of tenant selection and slum clearance. And now I learned a very different side of Los Angeles, both geographically and politically. We had the task of helping families to find other housing so that the area where they lived could be really demolished and a new housing project put in. We had actually built the first housing project in an area that was cleared land, and families had not had to be moved. That was Ramona Gardens. And that's where my office was, in Ramona Gardens. And I had an interesting experience.
That's still in existence.
Still there. That was our first housing project. And it was especially interesting because the Taxpayers Association was very strong in its antagonism. And they would say, these people won't know how to live in housing projects. And they would cite instances in places in the East where people filled the tub with coal and this kind of thing. They wouldn't know what to do. But I saw families move in whose laundry hanging on the line was gray, really dismal looking. And when you see the same laundry week after week, it was turning white. They had not had any hot water before, and you saw a change in lifestyle, and it was quite interesting.
Now, were you able to document that for anybody to have any impact?
I used to talk about it with the taxpayer group, and every now and then there would be a press release about what the effect was on families living there. But after, I worked there at the end of 1940. By the beginning of 1942, it had become a war housing program. I was not interested in war housing, and Family Service of Los Angeles had offered me a job. So I left the housing.
So that's in 19...
This was now in January of 1942.
Al, I should just, for the record, let people know that Al we're talking about is Al's your husband.
Al had been working at the research division of the Planning Council, and by February of 42, he was in the Army, and was there until November of 45. And then he went back to the Planning Council at that time to the research division. research division, and he also had the job of demolishing the social service exchange. And in lieu of that, setting up a welfare information service. So he started the welfare information service, which is now InfoLine in Los Angeles. But I stayed.
You went to Los Angeles Family Service.
I went to Los Angeles Family Service.
In what capacity?
I went there as a caseworker, but within 2 months, I went there in February, and by May, I was setting up the first Homemaker Service in Los Angeles. And that was, for me, everything I've done is interesting. I do it because I think it's going to be interesting. But it was something that I had really picked up in the State Relief Administration because there was a housekeeping project. Remember that under the FERA there were work projects, and the effort had been made to find work for women who had never done anything except be at home, and so they started sewing projects. They had housekeeping projects so women could go to help people who were sick, to take care of children.
I didn't know that.
They had the first adult education, which led to our subsequent adult education. But this was a way of developing skills among people who had never worked. And that had stayed with me because I had seen some people who were so thrilled at being able to use the skills they had acquired just caring for their own families. During the war, there was a great problem in how to help families where the husband is in service, the mother might have to work, or the wife became sick, and what do you do with the children? The husband isn't there. And so we developed a homemaker service. It turned out that there was one in New York in the Chief Family Agency, but we didn't know that then. When I began to ride around the country, I learned about that. But the idea had come to me really out of the housekeeper project of the State Relief Administration. And so we set up a homemaker program where we recruited and trained women who could go as substitute mothers into homes where one parent was available only and needed help. Or there might be 2 parents, but one was sick. And to keep the family intact. This program continued for a few years. Sometime later, I went back to give them some help in retraining some of the women. When Al and I came back from Chicago in 1953, the program was still operating. They had run into some kind of a snag. I don't really remember now what it was, but I went back for 3 months to help them reorganize it. I don't really know when it fell into disuse, but it had operated.
Well, of course, it's back. There are a number of programs for the elderly and for disabled
and
that are in operation.
Very similar to those.
So that was a forerunner.
This was a forerunner, and it was, they just called it Family Service Homemaker Service. So I did that. George Nickel, whose path has crossed mine so many times, was on the board of Family Service. And he was the chair of their personnel committee. And sometimes after a board meeting, we would have lunch together. One day he said, Los Angeles County is going to reorganize its public program, and they're looking for new blood, and you should apply. I was really not interested. This was now in 1943. Al was stationed up at Berkeley. He was being trained to be dropped behind the German lines, and any dialect of German that was indigenous to that area. And I would go up to Berkeley if I could raise the money. I never had enough gasoline to drive. But I would go up every couple of weeks and spend the weekend. He might still be on duty, but I was there and I wanted to see him. I wasn't about to make a change. And on one day, George Nichols said, let's have lunch at Old Felipe, not the one where it is now, but then on Macy Street. And the family service was located at 3rd and Main. So we went up there, and he very carefully walked me back by the county administration building and stood there while I made an application for district director in what was still the Bureau of Indian Relief. And I really did it because of him. And I had no expectation that they would be interested in me, but I began to read more about what they were doing. I still had a great interest in public welfare, which I had developed earlier, as you know. Then I had notification of the examination, and it was a written examination with essays. A lot of questions, multiple choice.
And then you had that 3-hour essay to write.
Yes, and then I didn't hear anything for a couple of months, and I really forgot about it. I received a telephone call at family service one day from a woman named Alice Nurse. Did you know her?
Yes, I did.
She said, who the hell are you? I'd never heard of her before. And so I said, well, you asked for me by name, so you must know. And she said, how does it happen that you were number 1 on the list? I did not know that on a Tuesday when the list is promulgated, the names of the first 3 people on the list become public knowledge. This is my introduction to that. I was number 1 on that list. Are you going to take the job? I said, I didn't know. Nobody had offered it to me. She called me every day for weeks to find out if anyone had called me. A couple of weeks later, I did get a call from Beulah Lewis. Beulah Lewis was a graduate of this school in the 1930s. She had been chief of medical social service at the county hospital. Arthur Will had become the superintendent of charity, and at that time, according to our county charter, the superintendent of charities had responsibility for all public welfare and for all health services, not public health, but medical services. He had known Beulah, and he had helped her into heading up the Bureau of Indian Relief. He was a man who believed very much in standards, and Arthur Greenlee had now been out of the department for a couple of years, and they have had political appointees, and it was rife with politics, the whole agency. He had gone to the Board of Supervisors and insisted that there had to be new standards. Professionally qualified people had to be in the department, that this in the long run would be a saving not only human lives, but money to the country. And they had allowed him to go ahead. They had 14 districts in the Bureau of Indigent Relief. Everybody, in effect, was there because of political appointment, but they also had tenure under civil service. He was able to reorganize departments. They had different offices for old age assistance and blind, and different offices for age-dependent children. There was now federal money under the Social Security Act. And the aged families with children, the sub-ABC for time, also included general relief. They were all in separate offices, and he combined them into single offices serving a geographic area, and in that way was able to open up 3 positions and took in 3 people with postgraduate degrees. The other 2 also were graduates of the school, Lenore Costigan and Opal Pundit, both long since deceased. They had been graduated with MSSW in the 20s and had a lot of experience. I was the youngest of the 3, and I was the youngest district director in the county. Gilda Lewis talked with me first, and she was very excited about what the prospects were. And then I talked with Arthur Hill, and he asked me interesting questions. How long I had been on each job, how long I had been married, how long I had lived in the same house. He was looking for stability. And then he asked me if it worried me to be on the receiving end of criticism. And I didn't think it did, but I didn't know because I really hadn't had that experience. And so he hired me. And I went, this was October of 1943. I've been family service.
How did Al feel about it?
Al was at Berkeley, and I had been writing to him. He thought it was exciting because his heart was with public service, too. And he said, what's the first thing you're going to try to do? And I said, change the name of the agency. It took 2 years, but that changed. But Beulah Lewis and I became good friends, and Arthur Will. And his son later himself became county administrative officer, and then subsequently his son did. But Arthur Will is the one who called me in one day and said, you better go up to Camp Cook and see your husband this weekend. Why? Because it wasn't my weekend. So he said he's going to be moving out. And he knew that because his son's unit was moving in. So I did go to see Al at Camp Cook. Donna had been born by that time. And a few days after I was there, Al had moved to work. And also, when Donna was born in 1945, I was at the California Lutheran Hospital, and I couldn't understand why my room was filled with flowers. All the men in my family were overseas, and the only person who was around was Stella, and I was seeing her all the time. My room was filled with flowers, and the superintendent of the hospital would come in every day to see how I was. Then I discovered that Arthur Will had called him and said, you take care of her. So even though it was wartime and people were there for short, actually I was there longer than the 2 days because I had some complicating situations. And I was there for 2 weeks. But that man came in to see me every day, and Arthur Will would show up every day to see how he experienced. It was an interesting stuff. He was a very cold kind of person on the outside.
Wasn't he pretty conservative in many ways?
Wasn't he what?
Pretty conservative in many ways?
Yes, except you could persuade him. If you gave him a logical reason, then he would move heaven and earth to get that through. Yes, because he was conservative is really why he had gotten the appointment to begin with. But his deep conviction about the importance of human services and the importance of standards really carried him a long way. There are many times when Jill and I became the deputy director of the agency,
well, this was when?
Well, this was in 1945.
And by this time, it was now called the Bureau of Public Assistance.
Now it was the Bureau of Public Assistance. But in that position, I had a lot of opportunities to talk with him about needs of people. But he'd been receptive even before then. When I went into Belvedere District, which was the largest family agency, it was an amalgam of 3 offices. And people didn't talk to each other. They were in competition. They would come from 3 different offices. The previous director, I had a very large office with a wood-paneled wall, which divided the office from a very large room in which 100 desks were located. There were some other rooms also with 100 desks. But the man who had been my predecessor had removed one of those panels so he could watch what everybody was doing. And I put the panel back. And said if people wanted to talk to me, they could come to my office. Or I could see them in the hallways, whatever. But I was not about to spy on them. Those who'd come out of old age assistance didn't talk to the people who'd come out of the family district. And I had my first real experience in how you get a staff of people competitive and antagonistic to work together. And it was a very simple thing. I set up a committee involving, we know all about committees, involving people from these different segments and the clerical staff, because this man's idea had been that the social workers were there only to carry out things that the clerical staff did. They were the ones who were at the top. And you had to really build a self-esteem of the professional staff and get them on an even level. So we set up I had trouble getting some people to serve on it, but after I found out whose interests were what, and I made some mistakes, but then I could correct them by adding more people. We set up a committee that would have 2 tasks. One, to help me plan an agenda for Friday morning meetings where everybody had to come. They'd never had meetings. And the other task was to arrange for coffee at those meetings. And over coffee, they couldn't fight. It was really a phenomenal experience. It took quite a while. But it worked very well. And we set up different kinds of committees, and I would meet regularly with the clerical personnel to help them understand that they could not leave certain things out of the dictation just because it had prompted them to use certain words. They simply changed the workers' dictation to suit themselves. And I tried to explain to them that certain kinds of behavior which the workers would note were significant because it would help us understand what to do to help those people to behave differently. I conducted an educational program for clerical staff along with one for the social nurses. We were located in a county health building, and the medical staff and the social workers in the health department, we were their tenants, could not talk to our personnel. And so I also had to begin working with them. And then I set up a district-wide committee with the police, really the sheriff's department there. It was the man who had a juvenile delinquency in that district of the sheriff's department who then helped us to set up the delinquency control institute. The Norris Class was very interested in juvenile delinquency. When I was getting my master's, I also had taken courses in public administration, and except for writing the thesis, I had completed all of the work there, and I had come to know Kitchener very well. And he and Norrie had become interested in delinquency control.
Now, Norrie came to the school in 41?
In 41. And I had known him before.
So you took courses before?
No. I knew him because when I was writing my thesis, which was on training and public welfare, Arlene had suggested that I write to him. He had a child welfare in Oregon. And we became pen pals. So that when he came down to Los Angeles to be interviewed about coming to the school, he stayed with Al and me. I had not met him before, except through correspondence, but that's when we became friends. And then he must have come in 1941, because I was still with the housing program then. And he didn't like my leaving because he said they were going to need people like me. But I didn't want to work in Boris. And I had moved here. So I came to know him then. But then he and Kitchener were talking about what could be done about delinquency control. And I had been telling Norrie about the Captain Stalling in the sheriff's office, who had begun to develop a very active program with me around the East Los Angeles area. And so Norrie and Kitchener and I met, and then we brought other people into committee. Stalling was one of them. And that's how the Delinquency Control Institute started. We met every week for a couple of years. Every Thursday we meet.
That started when then?
Well, it started in 1945, actually. But between us, Norrie and I had brought people in from the community. I wasn't at SC at the time. At that time. Well, in a way I was, because I had begun to teach courses in public administration extension.
Okay, now, tell me about your affiliation with USC now, from the other end, from the non-student end of things. Now, before that, though, then you were district director, and then you were deputy director of the bureau.
District director for the Belvedere district.
From when to when?
From October 1943 until March 45. And then I became deputy director for the county. And I did that for a year. I found that too difficult because Donna had been born, and I felt it was very important that I be with her. Al was still overseas, but I be with her not only before I went to work, but when I got home. Arthur would call me at 5 o'clock and say, will you go so-and-so, such and such a place, and give them a talk about something. He might do this 4 times a week, which would knock out my evenings, and I finally said, I just can't do that. So I went back to Belvedere, and I stayed there until 48. So that worked very well. Then we had a referendum which transferred the programs of old age assistance and ages line to the state. And
that was 49, wasn't it?
48.
48?
48 was the first referendum. We had another one in 49, which returned it. I had always thought that state administration was better than county administration. And so I took a leave of absence from the county and went to the state in this new program. And I became the social service officer for 20 counties. That was really something. I learned a lot of things. One was that state administration is not good. And I also learned, Norris Class and I had a bet. He had said that he was in Chicago. The referendum would not pass. And I thought it would. And we bet $5, and he sent me a check for $4.94 because an airmail stamp was 6 cents, and he deducted it. The next year, there was another referendum to return these age categorical programs to the county. And again, Norris bet me $5, but it was not passed. But this time he had to pay me the full $5 because he was back in Los Angeles. And I went back to the county and had responsibility for the metropolitan area. 2 districts were largely old age and blind, but there was now somebody else in Belvedere. And so I stayed there until we decided to go to Chicago in 1950. So I was barely a year in that office. I took a leave from the county because I thought we were going to be in Chicago 1 year. And then when I realized we'd be there another year, I asked for an extension, which they gave me. But after 2 years, I realized I didn't want to go back to the county. I wanted to do something else. And so I resigned from the county and ended that experience. But not before we had really done a lot of things. In the Belvedere district, I'd been able to persuade Arthur Will that because there were so few voluntary agencies serving that area from the city line to the county line, that we ought to have well-trained staff there. And so we created a new category of senior social workers, people with a master's degree. And we experimented with them in Belvedere. And we also got a county council opinion that in the absence of other agencies that could serve people, we could. The policy had always been that service without eligibility for public assistance was not possible. So we used this device that there were no agencies to serve, and so we provided service. That's when I hired June Brown, social worker, and Pat Murphy, who then later became the director for the county welfare department.
But she didn't have she didn't have a master's degree.
No, she came in as a public assistance worker in child welfare, but she worked with several of these people who were trained, and she began to see that there was something there. June also was the first black person in that area. And the Belvedere district had a lot of lower class, hard hat people. A big section, the largest Mexican population outside of Mexico City was there. But immediately adjoining it was a very restricted, conservative group. We could not bring a black person into that district without facing a lot of problems. And I kept looking for some, and you had to take people from the civil service list. And I got a lot of applicants of black women. I don't remember anything. Black women. But I didn't think they would fit, and I'd have quite a time persuading them not to insist on coming to Belvedere. Transportation was a problem. And I really would have to talk them out. But then along came June, who also spoke Spanish. That had been her major at UCLA. And I couldn't hire her because she wasn't from the fund. She thought that I wasn't taking her because I didn't want someone black. But on her 21st birthday, I sent her a telegram reminiscent of when I had been rehired to come to work. And so she came to work on her 21st birthday. She was the first black in that area. And, people liked her. And she was very good. But she also really picked up some of the sense of importance of welfare education. And
the way she tells the story, the way she picked it up, a lot of the way she picked it up is you're pushing her.
I pushed her. I pushed quite a few of those people, and quite a few of them actually went on to get education and social work, either here or someplace else. We had a very good staff. They did a wonderful job of service. And so after I'd been, we did a lot of things. We had the senior work group. I used to have the staff give me memos about problems they encountered. One of our big problems was a county store. There was no mandatory requirement that ABC families have a clothing allowance. And the man who was still then the county administrator had walked to school barefooted for 5 miles, when he was a kid. And he was not about to resolve the county store. And when we had a couple of children run away because they didn't want to go to school, when they undressed for gym, they were wearing the same kinds of clothes that marked them as county children as others. I had the staff write these memos. I send them in to Arthur Will. And he really tried to get that, as superintendent of charity, to get that store eliminated. But he couldn't do it because, for one thing, the women who had no experience could work as seamstresses. They could make these clothes. So you had a sewing project. And then here were all these kids suffering as a result of the sewing project, where they'd buy thousands of yards of identical material, you knew who was getting welfare. When Pat Murphy became director of public welfare, he resurrected all of these memos. And now Arthur Will was the chief administrative officer. And together they took this to the Board of Supervisors and got rid of the county store. It took 18 years.
That's a beautiful story.
So you know, things that you don't really see where they're going to end, but if you trust them out, something happens. So Belvedere was a really marvelous experience. We tried a lot of other things. The Friars Club would have a Thanksgiving dinner. We had 3,000 children in foster care in Belvedere district. And somebody from the Friars Club called once and said they'd like to have all the children, as many children as we wanted, to come to a lunch. And I thought about that lunch, and I thought that would be fine, except I thought, and they would give them all a present. And I thought they ought to give them something that they would appreciate. And we'd like to have children who were in institutions and foster family care as the first target. And so we had, I can't remember where the luncheon was, but they had 1,800 children. They gave everyone presents, roller skates, and they asked me, what did they want? And from one of the workers I had learned about a child who was in a Catholic institution out in Belvedere, I can't think of the name of it, who wanted a pair of red socks because she had to wear blue and black socks all the time. They wore uniforms, and I had told her every kid had bright colored socks, and then they raised money, and they gave me $2,000. We were not allowed to have cash. There had to be a special action by the Board of Supervisors for us to have this in cash to use for special instances with children in foster or institutional care. Well, we were able to do that, and they continued that. Then Pat Murphy had a family that he worked with for over a year. The parents and 2 children had been away from home when there was a fire, and 5 children in the home died. The father could not bring himself to leave the house after that. He lost his job, he couldn't work, and Pat Murphy worked with him, and finally got him to walk around the corner, and then to look for a job. And then he was going to be able to go back to work. He was a welder, but he could only go back to work if he could pay the reinstatement fee to the union. It was $12, which tells you how money has changed in value. And we had a petty cash fund, but we couldn't use it for this kind of thing. So I called Arthur Will and said we could get this man to work if he would agree to my putting $12 from the petty cash fund into this special payment. He hated to have anything in writing, he said. Well, do it if you want to, but don't ask me in writing. So I sent him a confirmation that I had paid the $12. I was ready to pay the $12 myself, but we paid it out of petty cash. Man got a job, went back to work. For about 10 years, I was billed every year by the county auditor's office for that $12, which grew in interest because it was an illegal expenditure. And I refused to pay it. I had confirmed that, but it wasn't $12, but it was the principal. And finally, when Pat Murphy became the director, I now owed them $19 and something. It had grown over the years. And he went to the Board of Supervisors and had that canceled. But that was the way the county operated. Everything was rigid, but you could find ways of getting around things. And we really gave wonderful service. Not by everybody, and not to everybody, but really great service.
Right, so that went until you worked there.
I worked there until we went to Chicago in September of 1950.
And then you came back from Chicago in 53?
In 53. And in Chicago, I had worked with the Jewish Family and Community Service. I started there as a caseworker, the agreement being that I could take whatever classes I wanted. So I went to school full-time, I worked there full-time, and they were in the midst of implementing the Displaced Persons Act of 1949, taking families from Europe or from Asia, in some instances, displaced persons. And after I'd been there 2 months, I started here in October of 50, and by January, I was directing the Displaced Persons program, and I continued that until we left. And before we left Chicago, I had agreed to write a history of the agency. And so, and I gathered all the material, and I wrote it in Los Angeles and sent it back. But that also gave me the idea that I could do part-time things and be at home when Donna came home from school. I was surprised at the number of organizations that were interested in somebody like me doing a part-time thing. And then Al, after a year, said, that you're doing the equivalent of 2.5 full-time jobs. And I thought back about it, and I see that was right. I wasn't going to do it anymore. And that's when Arlene asked me to come.
And that was what, 55?
55. And so I came. I had been teaching all along, both in public administration and group social work.
And you came teaching casework, I think.
Yes, I had, when I was at Chicago, although I had taken a number of courses in administration and social policy, all the ones they have in the doctoral program, I had also taken Helen Harris Perlman's third-year casework and Charlotte Toll's teaching and learning social work. They were both writing their books on those subjects. And that had been really a tremendous experience. So when I came back, Arlene saw me as a caseworker. And while my interest still was social policy, I did start by teaching casework. And I guess I did that for a couple of years.
Now, there was a period I know when you were very active in the Welfare Planning Council, and you were chair of a number of committees, including the money management one. And you share a little bit of that, and also some of the people, as I recall, because having served on a couple of your committees, some of the people you had as key people in your committees, like what's the name after they came out from the Taxpayers Association. They were your, you were saying earlier that you had to fight with them at one point, But somehow or other over the years,
we got along very
you
well.
had them on your side, and they were serving on your committees, and also people like Dodson.
I did an oral history interview with him recently.
Oh, did
he
you?
was reminding me of those early days. Well, my first experiences with the Taxpayers Association really was when I went into the housing program, because they were fighting tooth and nail against public housing. And then when I learned about my appointment to the county program, when I had been interviewed, but I had no confirmation of that appointment as district director. And I was driving my car, and I turned the news on, and there was a man whom I'd never heard of before, but turned out to be George McLean, who was the leader of this senior citizens group and led that referendum change. And what I heard him say, and now that Will has the audacity to hire 3 women for the county of Los Angeles, and they're just going to be as terrible as everybody else, and he named us. And that was the first I knew that I had been hired. But I never got along with George McLean. It was not just what he believed in. I thought he was a great exploiter. But there was something about his personality that I found very objectionable. And he was one of the few people where I felt I had to really watch what I was saying, because I would react to him. I would feel myself bristling, and I had to watch that. But I had a lot of experience with taxpayers groups when I was in the public agency. And sometimes I couldn't persuade them to my way of thinking, but very often I could. And I would have some of them come to the agency, and confidentiality was a serious thing, but it was not as constrained then. And sometimes I would ask somebody from the Taxpayers Association to go with the workers to a family. Not selecting the family, but selecting the workers who can interpret. And this was really a tremendous thing. I think I must have done that maybe 10 or 12 times altogether.
That's a terrific idea.
But it really worked, and we got some very important people on our side, including the man who was then the head of the Merchants and Manufacturers Association, Dave, and I can't think of his last name, down with an N. But he, and eventually, his daughter became a social worker. Out of this. But when I was with the county program in Belvedere, we had, I was in this district with all these families and children's cases. And the Welfare Planning Council, where I had done odds and ends in research from time to time, asked me to chair the Child Welfare Division. And so I did. I served on committees, but it was in that period that I became chairman of the Child Welfare Division. And I was in that division for quite a while, because it was while I was there that we began to examine the few minority acceptances into institutions. And also the big problems had begun to emerge with adoptions. And we set up a committee to examine the adoption issues. and then set up a county commission, committee, which was chaired by Jim Ludlam, and then a statewide committee emerged from that, which was chaired by Charles Shotland. And these two committees dealt with the issues around independent adoption. You know, people were rushing back to the cradle to take children, and the black marketing was a serious issue. And it was as the result of these two committees that the 1950 changes in state legislation came through, where public agencies could become adoption agencies, and we could move from having just the Children's Home Society and the Sons and Daughters of the Golden West. Those were the only two adoption facilities permissible in California. So the Sons and Daughters really had fallen into disuse by then. It was just the Children's Home Society, which was statewide. But it was as a result of the activities of that division that these other things came to pass. So I remained active. When I came back from Chicago, I chaired several committees. When I came back from Chicago, Al became director of the health division. In fact, Dick Pfeiffer had gone back to Chicago to prevail on him to do that. And we came back a couple of months earlier than we expected, because they were going to have an examination of the Welfare Planning Council, and Dick was very anxious that Al be in place and pick up the health division. One of the things that I was asked to do when we came back in that period by Elizabeth Frank, Jen Carter, who asked me if I would review the material on the Welfare Planning Council's experiences in mental health and do a history of mental health activities. And I did that, going back over the minutes from the earliest days. And several things emerged. One was that something would be started and then it would be dropped. Some things would begin, like the Mental Health Association and the first psychiatric clinic. Arlene Johnson was involved in those, but they would run out of interest. And so there was always something starting and ending, really just falling into disuse, without any kind of a pattern, a plan for what there should be. Al read that report, and that's when he decided that we needed a blueprint for Los Angeles County, and developed the idea of a study of mental health services in Los Angeles County, with the idea of developing a blueprint and using community organization techniques to involve people in the various aspects of the study so they would be in place and ready to implement recommendations. And so I worked with him on that, but not very much. It really grew out of this other, but he was convinced that this was absolutely essential, and everyone said, you'll never get it funded. And he went to see Portia Hill, who was then the director of community services for the state department of mental, I don't remember whether it was so-called mental health or mental hygiene. I think mental hygiene.
We were a continuation of the interview with Frances Feldman, in connection with the California Social Welfare Archives on Tuesday, October 24th. We had just been talking about the mental health project, and Portia Belvedere was interested in Al's suggestion.
She didn't think it was so impossible as other people did, and so she provided the money to fund this for the first year. Actually, I guess for a couple of years. And so he began to mobilize people.
This was 19...
It started around 1958. He was not able to find... He wanted a social worker to do this because he thought social workers' community organization skills were absolutely necessary, as well as the knowledge of research. And he interviewed a number of people from around the country. He couldn't really find the kind of person that appealed to him and was able to do this. I went to a national conference on health and welfare in St. Louis. And while I was there, I bumped into Wayne McMillan. I had not known Wayne in Chicago. I had only known of him. Al had known him. But it occurred to me that he might have all the skills that Al was looking for.
He taught community organization and research.
And research.
No, and statistics.
Yes.
Chicago.
And he'd been involved in politics in Chicago, so he knew how to deal with the political entities. And so I telephoned Al from St. Louis. Making long distance calls in those days was really something you just didn't do very easily. And I asked him whether he had thought about Wayne, and he hadn't. So he called Wayne, and Wayne was very excited about the prospect. He was ready to leave Chicago. His mother had died. That's what really made me think of his availability. And so he came to work to head that project, which was a tremendous activity. And as you know, it set the pattern for similar studies and other systems.
That really was a real pace setter.
Yes.
And the whole experience. The results of that lasted for years and years.
Yeah, and some of the activities are still ongoing. Well, you had asked me about my involvement in the Welfare Planning Council and so forth. I picked up some parts of that study. Somebody else had done the report on the psychiatric court of Los Angeles, and then suddenly didn't want to do anything more on it. So I pitched in and finished that and wrote that chapter. And you'll remember that we worked together on public health and mental health. Then Al, having finished that, the report itself was published in 1961, and they came out with 99 recommendations. And the question was, how do you implement them? And he had prepared a proposal to NIMH to set up the Development Commission, and they funded that. And it was funded then for 5 years. Al, meanwhile, had come to USC to work in the Youth Studies Center. And he was using his community organization skills because they were working in Santa Monica and trying to mobilize the Santa Monica community as an example really a demonstration area for delinquency control. But he wasn't too happy with that particular job because he found it too confining. When NIMH then funded this proposal, he agreed to go back to the Welfare Planning Council and be the director for the Mental Health Development Commission. And so he did that for the 5 years. I chaired a couple of the committees in that process, one on public health, one in industry, and I did some things with the police and sheriff's department. I can't quite bring forth what those were, but there were 3 aspects of it that at different times I worked on. He had arranged from the outset with a professor at UCLA to do the evaluation. And 5 years later, this man not only had done nothing, but he didn't want to. And here the project was finished while there were pretty full records of what had happened. There still was an evaluation report to write. What were the learnings from this? And so, as has happened in the past, I was conscripted into service and did that report with a committee. We learned quite a lot from doing the report about how you examine minutes and how you evaluate the people who were part of the process. So that was the mental health aspect. In the course of that project, really the mental health survey, Al had begun to work with Portia Hume on passage of what became the Short Doyle Act. The first proposal, which had been in 1955, which is when he first began to talk with her, that first proposal was known as the Hume Bill, and it did not pass, and it didn't get out of committee in large measure because of the anti-mental health groups in the Los Angeles area, and simply couldn't get it out of committee. They started again in 57, and this time it did pass. Al did a tremendous amount of work on that, including setting up a local commission. He had also, without any problem, persuaded my brother Jack to get a committee set up in the County Medical Society, which was done with some difficulty because the State Medical Society was unwilling to tackle anything on mental health. There is such a network of negative forces. The leader of this anti-mental health measure, or any program, was in Chicago, the stepfather of Nancy Reagan. And he had been influential in keeping state associations, state medical societies from endorsing anything. Al and Jack together decided that the person in the County Medical Society who could probably, if he could be persuaded to do something about this activity, could be most influential would be Dr. Billy Dworak. Do you remember him? And I remember him very well because several times when I had made reports for committees to the Board of the Welfare Planning Council, he would be very attacking, as he was with everybody. He was always on the opposite side. And Al decided that if he could persuade Louis Bullock to support this program, he would have to do it by telling him out. All these other people were against it. And Louis could be the person. That was a very ticklish kind of thing. Louis Bullock was then president of the Tuberculosis Association and also president of the Heart Association. Al's doctor, who was our very good friend, was active on both and had a lot of influence with Louis Bullock. And so Al went to see him, Clifford Cherry, and he thought it was a good idea to get Louis Bullock involved. And he was also very influential in both state and county medical associations. He got Louis Bullock to talk to Al about this, saying all these people were against this, and Louis Bullock, of course, would be for it because he was an advocate of good health in TB and in heart. And so Cherry got Bullock interested. Bullock thought it was terrible the way all these people were treating Al. And so he and Al then met with Jack. Jack said he thought maybe Louis could get a mental health committee set up in the county medical. He said if anybody could do it, he could do it, and he would do it. And so he did. He got it set up with Jack as its chairman. Meanwhile, Al set up a commission with Louis as its chairman. And shortly after this was done, and they were going to now try to persuade the County of Los Angeles to implement the Short Doyle Act, Al had a massive coronary. This was in late 58. And what he kept worrying about in the hospital was his committee. They were to meet who was going to help Louis be on the right track. And so this was summer, Al had had his attack the morning of commencement. I remember coming for commencement and sitting in the office worrying about Al. And that night I said, would he feel better if I could have summer free if I took on the committee? And he did. So I staffed the committee that summer and worked closely with Louis Bullock and Roger Eggerberg was the county was the director of the county hospital. He had been very devoted to Al. They had put on several programs at the county hospital. One was a demonstration in home care. And Eggerberg, there was something between them that was really very interesting. And when Al got out of the hospital and came home, Roger Eggerberg came to see him almost every day for those 3 months when Al had to be at home. And I could hear him coming because he'd park his car down on the street. And I would hear him walking up the driveway and say, where is that son of a bitch? Where is that malingerer? You know, and all the neighbors would hear. And by the time he'd get to the house, Al would be just dissolved in laughter. Well, I worked with Eggerberg, and he really worked with Louis Bullock to keep him on the right path. And at the end of that summer, Roger had agreed to serve as the mental health director for Short Doyle while still director of the county hospital. So this was the interim measure. My brother Jack was appointed by the Board of Supervisors as the chair of the new Mental Health Advisory Committee, and he did that for 12 years. So when Al was able to get back to work, he really could get everything moving. It was a very exciting time, but I did a lot of talking in the community. But, it showed how useful some of the knowledge of social work history is, because I remember being before a group of Minute Women. They're the ones who had really kept this from going through. They were the anti-fluoridation, the anti-vivisectionist, the anti-mental health group. And I had agreed to speak to a luncheon group in Pasadena, and when I walked in, I recognized these ladies whom I had seen. And I thought, I'm not up to this. I don't know how I'm going to manage this. And, it's all I could think of is the way they had behaved at boards of supervisors meetings and so forth. But I had just come from my class in social welfare history, and I said, how many of them had ever heard of Benjamin Rush? Well, several had. How many of them were daughters of the Revolution? Quite a lot of hands went up then. Did they know that Benjamin Rush was the father of psychiatry in America? Couldn't believe it. He signed the Declaration of Independence. This was a crucial period because these women were among the leaders who were saying that that all psychiatrists were Jews, that all Jews were communists, that all Jewish psychiatrists were brainwashing people, and that you could expect that if this act passed, there would be a knock on somebody's door in the middle of the night, and the person would be whisked off to Alaska. Do you remember how that was? Because at that time, Congress was considering a neuropsychiatric institute in Anchorage, which was a territory of the United States. And these people somehow had tied together all of these strange pieces, and so nobody would be safe. Well, they were simply floored by the fact that Benjamin Rush, the father of psychiatry and the father and the signer of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, would be linked with this other. They were quiet. It was a fascinating meeting. And I often thought after that how useful tidbits of social welfare history can be. And that was the most telling thing for me. But getting back to the Welfare Planning Council, in 1956, and you were on this committee, and I maybe you were chairman of it, the research division did a study of Panorama City and found that many of the problems there centered around money management. And they wanted them they wanted them to do something about a more comprehensive study on money management and its implications. I had long been interested in money. George Nickel again comes into the picture, because I used to tell him about the fact that when I started in the State Relief Administration, I was always impressed by the number of people who couldn't ask for relief, but who would say, I need a loan until I get a job. Everything centered on their sense of adequacy related to work and what the money meant to them. And I had begun to read what I could find, which was not a great deal, about the psychological and social implications of money. Some psychiatrists had done a little writing, but it was really tangential. It was not a great deal. It was of interest and value, but it didn't have any lasting effect. George's company, Beneficial Management, would make a grant of $10,000 available to the Welfare Planning Council to do this kind of a study. I was asked if I would be interested, and I was, but they decided on somebody else.
I didn't know that.
Janet Nolan.
Oh, yes.
Who was with the Pasadena Family Agency. And I don't know what the reasons were.
Excuse me.
I don't know what the reasons were for selecting Janet. And I think the committee had already been set up. But you don't remember that.
I didn't come on until afterwards, and I wasn't something you were heading it up.
Yeah. Something happened, and that fell through. I don't know why, and so again I was approached, but this time with a definite offer. And these were the years when I had been doing all these part-time things at home, which were exciting because there's such variety. But Al was sure that I was putting in too much time, and I guess he was really right. But you know, my pattern of fast sleeping, I have lots of hours doing things, and I didn't have a sense that I was putting in that much time. But I did, I was very interested in it, and George was delighted because he knew my long-time interest in this. And so a committee then was set up in the Welfare Planning Council, that he was its chairman. And we worked out what the scope of the project would be. And Elizabeth Frank was then the director of the research division. And we developed some consultants who would look in their own special fields for whatever there was. And I did a lot of interviewing in agencies as well as individuals. It was a very interesting project in a number of ways because, for example, when I called the executive of the Assistance League to see whether I could meet with the staff and talk about their experiences and reactions to money these days. They don't deal with money at all. I knew that they didn't give much in the way of relief, but that wasn't what I was interested in. Are there any problems among your client families of adolescents who want allowances? She didn't think so, but she agreed because she was a longtime friend, and put it on that basis that I could meet with her staff, and it was an interesting experience. There were 2 men on the staff and about 15 women, and all the women were knitting. And the executive was knitting, and every now and then somebody would evidently make a mistake or get stuck, and she would take time out to go over and show that person how to handle the knitting. It was a strange experience, and I thought about what this said about how one denied the importance of money. In actuality, the staff became very interested, and they gave me some very good case material. Then in another agency, Catholic Charities, I went made the appointment, and they were very receptive about it. But when I arrived, they said, well, I couldn't record it because they had no connection. And at that time, recording machines had to be plugged in. They didn't operate on batteries. They had no way of connecting a recording machine in any office large enough to accommodate the staff. So I said, all right, I would just simply make notes. We went into their library, and under my chair was an outlet. And I waited until the meeting started and then said, I wonder if they knew that there was an outlet that's hidden by the chair, and would anybody object if I connected my little machine to it? Well, nobody objected. But these are the kinds of things that came up, which were very intriguing. The ingenious ways people would avoid either letting you have material that for some reason they would think would be critical of them, or that they felt at a loss about. But it was a very productive experience, again, going through all of these agencies, now in a different way than when I had gone in 1940 for the community check, but some of the same agencies. All that we were required to do was to prepare a report. But I thought there was much more than just a report that could be used. And George Nickel had been talking to Dworak-Peck of the Family Service of America about it. And there was a conference at the beginning of May, I guess it was Health and Welfare Conference in Atlantic City. She had asked me to give a paper on the meanings of money, which I had agreed to do. And then she had said to me that George Nickel thought there was a book in this, and she didn't think there was. Didn't think there was that much in it. But she liked my paper, and she liked the things that it touched on. She said, if I could give her 5 chapters of a book by July 4th, this is early May, by July 4th, then she would read them. She was then going to Holland, and and if she didn't read them on her way to Holland, she wouldn't have time. And she wasn't about to buy a pig in the poke. I never will forget that. I had not yet given my paper. This was a luncheon conference, and at lunch she said, "Are you going to have a drink?" And I said, "No, I couldn't customarily drink at lunch." Well, that was good because she didn't want me to have a drink before I gave my paper. Proceeded to have 3 martinis herself. And by the time she'd had the 3rd martini, she was telling me about not buying a pig in the poke, but if I'd get 5 chapters to her by July 4th. And I thought, how can I get 5 chapters to her by July 4th? Well, I did. When she came back from Holland, she said, now, you remember, I'm not buying a pig in the poke, but if you give me the other chapters, I'll read them. So I not only gave her the other chapters by the end of the summer, that was the fastest writing job I ever did.
I didn't know that it was that fast.
Yeah, well, of course, I put in a lot of hours during the day, and I had all the material. But even so, that was I never had a chance to go back and review what I had written because it always had to go right off. And so they published that in 1957. And so that's how that came to be.
That was a great book. And then, of course, you wrote a revised edition of that.
I revised it in 1976.
As I recall, that's been used an awful lot. Well, obviously, or else they wouldn't have asked you to revise it.
Yeah, it still is used. It surprises me because it's now a long time since the second edition, and I have not done any rewriting of it since. Family Service last year asked me if I would, but I didn't think I wanted to embark on that. But 2 years ago, a group of college instructors in money management counseling, which has an association which has been a couple of years old, had their annual meeting in Anaheim, and I gave the keynote address and was astonished to find that a number of them use it as a text still. And I see from the royalties that I get from Family Service, which never amount to very much, but they always show the number of books still sold, that it still is in use.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
Well, not remarkable, it's just very satisfying.
Well, it's remarkable because there has been so little done along this line. You get a lot of books now on how to spend your money, and sometimes they have a little in them about the psychological and social meaning, but not a great deal. The book that did the most on that was a psychiatrist who was the head of psychiatry of Tulane and had been a minister at Tulane Medical School. He'd been a minister before. He'd done pastoral counseling. He was involved in one of the Mental Health Development Commission activities, and Al was trying to get ministers, pastoral counselors around the country involved in mental health counseling. And this man had come out here to meet with Al and to meet with a group of pastors here. And he expressed a lot of interest in the implications of money for family life. About 2 years later, Family Service asked me if I had seen his book called For the Love of Money. And I hadn't. I got it out of the, I guess I bought one. And what he had done in For the Love of Money, he had one chapter, it's a very small book, one chapter which is copied word for word from Family in the Money World, with quotations around it, and gives credit. This is the chapter that deals with adolescence.
Doesn't have to get permission.
Never asked permission. And another chapter on the older person, which is word for word, but no quotations and no credit. Family Service had picked that up and had sued him for it. I don't know what came out of it finally. But here was this psychiatrist with a pastoral counseling background who plagiarizes 2 chapters. But he never let me know that he had written it, although he had written several times and asked me questions. So I thought that was really an interesting use of the Family in the Money World.
They say that flattery or whatever.
Yeah. But there's still interest in it. In my mail this morning was a letter from the National Council of Jewish Women saying that they, the executive and an associate executive, both signed the letters, and they're involved in some project in helping women to manage investments. And they have read this book. And when I meet with them to talk about it. So there are still interesting things come up.
That's great.
I always thought that the Alaska project was a result, in a sense, of a project that I had done earlier. I had worked at one time, as you remember, with the Department of Public Social Services under a different name, Indigent Relief. The person who was now the director of the County Welfare Department, Pat Murphy, his real name is Ellis P. Murphy, was now the director, and he had started his social work career when I was director of Belvedere District a number of years before. In the early 60s, he became concerned over the fact that there seemed to be a number of problems in the Public Welfare Department for which they had no answers, and they had no data on which to base answers. And he asked me at that time if I would undertake a project which would have several dimensions. One would be to see what was happening to a contract which the department had let to two group work agencies under the revised Social Security Act amendments of 1962, where they could demonstrate the use of purchase of services. And they had let out two contracts but didn't know what was happening as a result of those. So one dimension would be to evaluate that. Another was to see whether there would be any merit in setting up some kind of a locally based office of social services in a couple of the housing projects. Very large public housing projects that already were known to have delinquency problems. And I was especially interested, since I had had an earlier experience with slum clearance projects. And he would leave to me how that would be done. The other dimension would be how community organization techniques could be used to involve people in some communities in the interests of really forwarding the mission of public welfare. The Board of Supervisors accordingly wrote a contract with me personally because they couldn't see doing it with an institution, but a number of our faculty and some of our doctoral students became involved, and in actuality a couple of former students also became involved. Nancy Humphreys, for example, who is now dean of the school at Connecticut, was very interested in the community organization aspect. And so we developed that with her so that she could see how she could reach out to some of the disadvantaged communities and get agencies as well as community leaders involved. She worked out of her car because there was no office that she could use. So for several years she did that, and quite successfully. I evaluated the two agencies' contracts to see what had worked and what had not. And it shows the kinds of hazards that face a contracting agency. One agency was in central Los Angeles, central district of Los Angeles, South Central. The other was out towards San Pedro. Both of them were agencies headed by minority personnel, and this was one reason that Pat had been interested in their doing these projects. The purpose in each was that they would give a variety of services to families, including group work services. The group work and educational programs for the families would be central to these. And it was left to them to decide how they would do these projects. A grant of money was provided. They were supposed to account to the department for what they did, but no reports had ever come. I'll take a couple of minutes, if it's all right with you, because some of the later changes in the Social Security Act about purchase of services resulted from the recommendations that came out of these. The first project that I...
Frances, did you share with us when this was, what year?
Yes, this would have started around 1963. Because the amendments that permitted demonstrations of purchase of services were the 62 amendments, which became effective in January of 63. And so it was these projects had been in process for 6 or 8 months. I'm not sure. My contract was written with the board for the fiscal year beginning July 1st of that year. And I was to have complete freedom and also as much cooperation as I needed, and I did get a lot of cooperation from the department, but not from the two agencies involved. I made an appointment with the director of the first one, a long-established settlement house in South Central. She had some difficulty in working out an appointment time. We thought a lot of those days, as we still do, about what contributes to hostility and how is it handled. And it was very clear she was doing her best not to talk with me. It finally took a letter from the Board of Supervisors, really written by Pat Murphy, but with the board's okay, and a threat to withdraw the money if there could be no discussion about what they were doing. I made an appointment with her, and I told her the kinds of things we were interested in, namely, how many families and individuals had they been able to serve as a result of this contract, what kinds of services did they give, and what did she and her staff think were the outcomes of these. Very simple kinds of questions. We talked about it, and she said, well, they had served a lot of families, and she would get the figures for me if I insisted. I said I would like not only to know the numbers, but I would like to read a sample of the records. I made an appointment to come back. She called me and said the records were not available yet because the person responsible had been out ill. I left it to her to tell me when the records would be available, and she set a date 2 weeks hence. In that interval, I went to the other agency, and I encountered the same kind of experience. I went back to agency number 1 on the date appointed, and they had a stack of longhand records, all written in the same handwriting, yet there were supposed to be 8 different people. But there was no variation. Someone clearly had simply sat down and written a number of records. You could not, while I used the schedule to try to find out what had been done, why it had been done, how long it took, and these kinds of things. You couldn't pick that out. But what became evident was that these were not new clients. They had not reached out to add. They were using the county's money to support the program they had been operating on. I was never able to change my view on that because I couldn't get any evidence. The same thing happened in the other agency. The county's monies were being used not to demonstrate anything. This isn't to say that what they did wasn't good, but it was not the intent of the demonstration. I didn't pursue this with either of them. I wrote a confidential report to Pat Murphy and gave him my observations and the basis for them. And I recommended at that time that they use a set of guidelines for deciding who should have a contract, how to decide whether the guidelines were being fulfilled and whether, in fact, the objective of having additional services of a certain kind. For example, there were to be, in both of those projects, outreach activities to mothers in these disadvantaged areas to help them in their housekeeping functioning, how to simplify these, how to meet certain needs of children. None of that was ever done. These were straight recreation for children after school. I can't at the moment recall all. There were 10 recommendations. In 1965, the Social Security Act was modified in terms of its contract to purchase services, and they incorporated in their guidelines 8 of the 10 recommendations that had been made, and these became regulations authorized by the Social Security Act. I never did any follow-up to see whether they were really practical and effective, but evidently there was some thinking that these 2 experiences were worth noting. So that was the purchase of services part. Nancy was quite effective in getting a number of agencies to collaborate with the public agency in providing a variety of services. And that worked pretty well. She did what she was expected to do. And we were able, in the final report on the Project 220, which was the way it was labeled by the Board of Supervisors, to enunciate the community organization principles on which these activities were based and how they had worked. The other aspect of this project, I think, from my standpoint, was really the most important, and that was to set up an office in each of 2 housing projects to see whether trust could be established between staff and residents, whether they would begin to come in to use services. We developed a plan for group work services for daycare for children whose mothers might be able to be helped to find work without having to worry about who took care of them. Whatever kinds of services came up, the Project 220 didn't limit itself to just recipients of public welfare, although the original idea was that they would be aid to dependent children cases, but there was no limit set. We didn't do the service aspect. Staff did that. I conducted training programs with them in collaboration with departmental training staff. And our staff for the project then provided consultation and evaluation. Elizabeth McBroom was involved, Helen Northern was involved, Norris Class worked on the child care part of this. Reno Patty, now our dean, did some case review.
He was a doctoral student then?
He was a doctoral student. Helen Olander, also a doctoral student, worked on it. We had really a very prestigious group. The statistical part was done by Frank Pierce, who was a doctoral student at that time. So we had a really great team. The report then was sent not only to the department but also to the State Department of Social Welfare, which provided some additional funds in the summer so that we could do the evaluation part. So in I think there were 3 different summers, we paid these people out of State Department money, whereas the original contract with me was county welfare department money, local tax money. The State Department...
With heavy subsidies by the federal government.
Oh, sure. Sure. I'm sure that most of it came from the federal government, but they always made a point of telling me this was county taxes. And I didn't argue, although I knew how county taxes came into the picture. But it was an exciting project. A great deal was learned from having the two on-site offices. We did learn that if you had thoughtful, warm, interested social workers in the project, that the initial suspicion that the families would feel would be dispelled. How important this is, I think, is shown by the fact that the Watts riots occurred in 1964 when we were 2 years into that project and had the two on-site offices. A lot of people were very afraid to go into the Watts area, and a couple of people on our project were a little fearful, and it made it possible for them not to go, but most of them went. The families in those two projects, Jordan Downs and can't think of the name of the other one, a little further north, but the same kind, not as bad a locality as Jordan Downs. The families were very protective of the staff, and you could see them coming around and milling around outside the offices so that any negative force that might be there was
That's remarkable.
It was really an astonishing experience, and of course around the university itself, as you'll remember, all those buildings were burned and windows broken on 3 sides of the campus, the fourth side being the park, so it didn't count. Not a building was touched on the campus. Now, that was not our doing, but I think it is of interest that there was concern about the university. The governor appointed the McComb Commission to investigate what had started the riots and what should be done about them. I was asked to serve the commission as their social welfare consultant. They had one for housing, one for health. They had another one, I can't think of what that, economics, and one for social welfare. And while I worked with the staff of attorneys who staffed the commission, they really left it to me to decide how I would gather the data that I would present to them and on which I would base my recommendations. I used some of the Project 220 data, but I did a number of interviews with people who were regarded as leaders and non-leaders in the housing, in the Watts area. And I was very well received by them. People say, "You mean to say you're going down there?" But I worked with them long enough, and by this time I was known to a number, and there was no problem. We gathered some new data and some data that supported what we already have. And I presented the report in 2 days, 2 full days of meetings with McComb Commission. And those were really very interesting meetings because Mr. McComb, formerly of the CIA, had said in the meeting, "Why are there so many people down there without work? After all, my wife tries to get somebody to come and help her, and she can't get anybody to come. And you say there are all these people who want to work. And this was a reflection of several of the people on the committee. And yet there was a lot of evidence that it was hard for people to get to a job, to a place where they might even look for a job. If you had to spend 2 hours on a streetcar or a bus just reaching some other place, transportation was very bad. That was almost an impossible task for women with children to leave them, and when they had no one to care for them, occasional relative might be in the picture. They couldn't do much. Illness was a serious problem. They had no way of getting to the county hospital except on streetcars going several hours each way and paying what was then a lot of money. It might cost a woman $1.50 for herself each way, and dragging several children along with her. One of the things that came out of the McComb Commission, not my report, but the McComb Commission, was the importance of having a hospital, county financed in that area, and that led to the Martin Luther King Hospital being established in that area, which presumably made some difference. But we had a number of recommendations. I actually didn't work by myself. I did the work, but I asked several people to serve as consultants with me to be sure that I wasn't just going off in a direction that seemed right to me but might not seem right to others. So I had a group of faculty from here, from USC, and from UCLA who met with me several times to make sure that I wasn't being overly biased. I was biased to some extent. I don't know that I could have helped that. But they tried to help me be objective. The McComb Commission did not like my report.
I didn't recall that. I thought they
yes,
did.
They didn't like the report on health that was done by a couple at UCLA. They were supposed to publish the reports of the academic consultants as an addendum to the McComb Commission report itself. But because they didn't like my report, because I didn't think the people were to blame for everything, and they didn't like the health report for the same reason, they did not publish the promised addendum. And so NASW published my report. There was another report that they published. Joe Boskin had done one on the history of riots.
Oh, yes.
And so NASW put these two reports together and released those. The American Public Health Association published the one on health, and the housing report never got published at all. And what I always felt was that the commission itself, even though in some ways they were enlightened, could not bring themselves to change some basic attitudes that they had. One of the things that happened was that I can't think of his name at the moment, a man who was a member of the Chamber of Commerce of Los Angeles decided that people needed jobs and that the Chamber of Commerce had to do something about that. And on his own, he went into the Watts area and began to check to see what kinds of jobs, what could he get industry to do to increase the number of jobs. And he persisted in that. That led to the Business Council of Private Industry, which produced some jobs, and just recently to the board of the Social Welfare, California Social Welfare Archives. We elected John Cully, that's Kulli, who is working on an offshoot of that project to help young people in schools to be prepared to take jobs, to cut down on dropouts, and they have a council called the Business Council, which is now located in the Board of Education, originally sponsored and still is by the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. John was then the director of marketing for all of Sears nationally, and he was involved in that effort to help people. I met him differently in Pasadena some years ago, and he's been developing his own interest in how do you help families by reaching the parents so that they can keep the children in school. And he's, over the years, decided that when children are in high school, it's too late. You've gone back to junior high, you've gone back to elementary. Now they have a project where they provide education for parents. And he has 2,500 businessmen in Los Angeles County who work with him and go out to the schools to help young people understand why they should not drop out. He is also now involved in our schools' efforts to do something about school social work. So we kind of come full circle, but he had been involved in that offshoot of the McComb Commission and its assessment of the riots. Well, I think that as a result of Project 220, the HEW, which had gotten especially the report on purchase of service contracts, initiated a contact with me. The regional director called me, located in San Francisco, and said to me on the telephone, "Have you ever heard of rural Alaska?" And I had to laugh because I thought all Alaska was rural. I had been in Alaska on a short trip in 1946, and I had seen nothing to tell me it was not rural. I said, "Oh no, that wasn't rural." The federal government had made a substantial sum of money available to the state of Alaska to try to recruit and train Eskimos in very remote villages to recognize individual problems and to see what they could do about improving the conditions in their villages. The state of Alaska, with HEW, had employed an anthropologist to undertake this study, but after 2 months they realized that this was not the right discipline because the anthropologist developed a system for looking at what implements these people used in these villages for everyday living, and that wasn't what they wanted. And so in some fashion they got to me. I couldn't see myself going to Alaska, but I was interested in what they were telling me since I was going to be in San Francisco for a cancer board meeting. I agreed that I would meet with the representatives of Alaska and this man from HEW to talk about it and see whether I could think of anybody who might do this. I thought I'd come back to the school and everybody here would have great ideas, and I could say, here's a list of people to contact. The conference turned out to be with 2 people from the Alaska Department of Public Welfare, 2 people from HEW, and they had brought 1 Eskimo along. And they told me about the kinds of problems they had in the southwest part of Alaska, 100,000 square miles of tundra, with no communication outside of the town of Bethel, which was in the center and had 1,800 people and could be reached by airplane once a week from Anchorage.
That's rough.
Yeah, and when the weather permitted.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really very touched by their interest and the sincerity about wanting to do something. But I knew I was not the person to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I came home and talked to my husband about it to see if he knew anybody. And he said, make up your mind. You won't find anybody. You'll do it yourself. And that's the way it turned out. What we did then was to write 2 contracts. One was a personal one with me, and one was with what was being developed then as our Social Welfare Research Institute, which Genevieve Carter was coming in from Washington to direct. I would like to have had the whole contract, it would have been the first, with the Institute. But there were problems around that. One problem was really with HEW. They wanted to have direct access to the person they were hiring as consultant. The other was a university logistical problem, because at that time, the university would pay travel funds for one way. Do you remember? It was always a puzzle. How did you get the person back, or was this the return, and the person had to pay to go? Well, costs of travel in Alaska were absolutely horrendous, as were all other costs. And so it seemed expedient to write 2 contracts, and in my contract would be my personal reimbursement and compensation, and also the cost of transportation for all of the consultants, their payment, and the cost of operating the project otherwise would be under the direction of the Institute. So it was a peculiar kind of arrangement, but it worked out pretty well. We had several aspects to that project, and again, faculty worked with me on it. This was an area where there had been one anthropologist who had lived in one village for 1 year with his family in the villages of Puskiak, Dr. Oswald, who was at UCLA. And I met with him, and I got his perceptions of what it was like in that region. And also, he discouraged me because he thought it was an impossible task. Well, you know me well enough to know that it was the same reason Al said, you know you'll do it. When somebody tells me it's impossible, there's something in me that says there has to be a way. We developed a good team on that. All the research would be the compilation of the research data, and also the development of the research design for evaluation would be with the Research Institute. One of the conditions that I had set up, which I've always thought was pretty good, with the Alaska Department, my contacts were limited then with HEW, they were with the Alaska Department, was that instead of having an evaluation at the end, which is what the original idea of HEW was, that we would do ongoing evaluation so that as we found that some things worked and some things did not, we could modify. And also they would have feedback as we went along so that they could use it wherever they wanted to. And that really worked very well. There was no recorded history. at all of any of these 60 villages. And the fact is that fewer than half of the people who lived in them spoke English. At that time, they had no recorded language. The University of Alaska was developing one, but everything had historically been simply passed on by word of mouth. There was no way to get a hold on what the problems were, except as you could elicit some comments from these people. And I found very early that certain conceptual words that we use had no meaning. For example, I met, you want all this?
Yes.
I met one day in Anchorage with all of the people who had been recruited. There were 19 who had been screened and interested. And I said to one, I hoped that he would be able to tell me what he thought was the most serious problem in the 5 villages he had. He was a man who was in a village that was on the Bering Sea. And 3 of the villages were near him, within 200 to 300 miles, and one was on St. Lawrence Island, which was the closest point to Siberia in the United States. He looked at me and he didn't say anything. And I have learned several things about the Eskimos. One is that they use silence to express a great deal. It can be respect. You don't talk back to an older person, and I was older. They use silence to express hostility. And they use silence if they just don't know what the answer is. And he said nothing, and I couldn't decide which of these 3 it might be, but I didn't pursue it. I saw him 2 months later, and he said to me in his broken English, he was about 30 years old, he said to me in broken English, "You ask me problem. I know problem." He had not known the word. Now he could concretize it, because in his villages they had a special problem in having oil which could carry them through the summer. Just that in the time between my 2 contacts with him, 4 men from his village had gone out in a boat on the Kuskokwim River, which cuts through that whole area. It's very sandy. They had fallen into the river because their boat was overloaded with drums of oil they were bringing back from this town of Bethel. All 4 had drowned. They wear this very heavy clothing. It's always cold there. They would have about 1 week of summer in that region. And the minute they're in this sandy water, they're gone. There's no way to get them out. And he had decided, since they had so many such deaths, that what they needed was to have oil storage so that it wouldn't be necessary to do this. And that's a different matter. But he had not understood the word problem. And I thought about that. How do we get them to communicate to us what was happening? And so Genevieve Carter and I came up with the idea of buying 19 Instamatic cameras. And I supplied each one with a camera and rolls of film, showed those who needed to know how to operate them, but mostly they did know. They were very clever at mechanical things. They knew much more about it than I did. I asked them to take pictures of what they saw and what they did. They send me rolls of film. They send them to the department in Anchorage, and they would send them on to me. And I'd have a slide developed for my own use and one for the department, and have prints made and send them back to the Eskimos. It might take 5 months before they got them because the area froze by the middle or end of September. It was completely frozen in, and they didn't have breakup until May, sometimes June. So in between, you might get some communication through, but it was not likely. The first few rolls that I got from most of the Eskimos puzzled me, because all I saw on them was white snow and the sky behind, or it'd be brown tundra because there was no snow and the sky. No buildings, no people, no animals, nothing. So the first time I went back, I said to a couple of them, "Tell me what you see in these pictures." They said, "This is where the bear are. This is where we cut holes in the ground to get fish when everything is iced over. This is where the elk move." To them, there was a great deal of meaning in all of those. And, they did then come to make pictures of people and of structures and a variety of things that to us were meaningful. But I've often thought how different our cultural perceptions are, because they thought I would see all of this in these pictures. So you can see it was a fascinating project. As a result of it, a number of things were done. There was no radio or telephone communication, but they were able to bring this in. The first time I went on a trip to a village with a bush pilot, he couldn't take me to the one where I had an appointment because the weather was bad. After a couple of hours of waiting in the town of Bethel, he said if I wanted to, he would take me upriver because the weather was clear. And I decided I might as well go upriver, even though it cost $180 an hour. But I was having to pay him anyhow, whether I sat in the welfare office or went. And when we arrived at this village, Mission Village on the Kuskokwim, we could look down and see people lining up on the shore, and they were waiting for us. They had heard us. There was no way to let them know we were coming, but they had heard the plane. They had a very sick baby. They wanted to know whether we would take the baby and grandmother back to Bethel, where there was a U.S. public health hospital that had 30 beds, whether we would take the baby back with us. Now, it was just fortuity that we went there. They had no way of letting anybody know about this. Actually, the baby did die the next day. Infant mortality, or death up to age of 2, was very high. It still is, but it was worse then because they had no way of providing health care. And when they got these radio telephones set up in some of these villages, they would then call into this hospital in Bethel, give the symptoms, and the doctor or the nurse would suggest what they might do. So they did a lot of things there in terms of education and in terms of just day-by-day living. The project ended in 1971, and our feedback made it possible for the state of Alaska to decide that this was something they wanted to extend to the next disadvantaged area, which was Nome and that area. The oil money came in a year or 2 later, and then they extended it further. But it was a very successful project, and the University of Florida in 1975 did an evaluation of they selected what they call the 10 most successful demonstrations funded by HEW, and this is one that they included in that. All of that material now is with the USC archivist.
Good.
But it was an exciting project.
Well, I remember that. The excitement that you had all the way through, and all of us for you.
Well, it
was. You weren't directly involved.
It was wonderful. I said there was no recorded history. Mary Lou Summers, who used to be on our faculty and was then at the University of Chicago, came in 3 successive summers to do a history of the villages. That history has been used because she did interviews. Well, we asked the people to write out or get somebody to write out for them how the village started, why it's located where it is, and all these kinds of things that we have no way of picking up otherwise. And Mary Lou designed that part of
November 3rd, this is a continuation of the oral history with Professor Frances Lomas Feldman. We ended the last session with a report on Mary Lou Summers' contributions to the Alaska Project, and we're going to pick up on that now.
I think we left off with the contribution of Mary Lou Summers and the village histories. And I think there are only a few points more that are worth noting, only really so that they can encourage other people that when a study is done, it isn't just filed away. The Alaska project had some surprising results, not just in Alaska where they extended it to other sections of Alaska. But 2 summers ago I had occasion to be in Mali in West Africa and had been asked to spend 2 days in consultation with them. It had not been clear to me what it was that they wanted to consult with me about, except that I was going to be there anyhow, so I was interested. It developed that the 2 people who were to spend time with me have their doctorates in education from USC. They both had gone to the Sorbonne for their earlier work. One of those 2 people had had occasion to read the Alaska report. She was very interested in it because in Mali, in an effort to improve conditions of the people in the rural areas, they had realized that they had to develop a common language and a written language. And this was one of the problems that had been true of the Eskimos. While they had a common language, which is not true in Mali, they didn't have a written language, and everything had come by word of mouth over time. In Mali, they had 7 major tribes. They had developed a written language for 3 of those. They hoped to continue with the others. But they also were needing to reach the people in the villages, so they had trained a group of teachers to use this new written language. And now they were teaching primarily women, because all the work is done by the women in those villages. And they were using the language as a channel for communicating information about health and child care, agriculture, because the women did all the agricultural work, and in a variety of ways to improve their conditions. And what they had wanted to consult with me about is how we went about helping the Eskimos to recognize problems and do something about them in the absence of a written language. And so here the Alaska Project had an international impact, which was an exciting thing to discover. Now the material, and a lot of the material, especially the village histories, which Mary Lou had developed, had quite a lot of attention from anthropologists in various places. These are now all with the university archivist, who told me very recently about someone from Minnesota who has expressed interest in seeing them. He also has copies, he has all the slides that were made from the films that the Eskimos had taken. And the cinema department had put together a narrative with the films, which is also available there. And it was a very exciting project.
It was. I do recall. And I think we commented before, not on tape, about how the faculty, your colleagues, we couldn't believe that you were the one who was going and doing all those things, including just a couple of the events that you mentioned, about the jail and about the sleeping on the floor, for example.
Yes, I think that maybe the biggest shock for me, maybe the hardest thing, turned out not to be the fact that you had to sleep on the floor and climb into the jail in order to get water, and to fly in bush pilot planes in hazardous weather. But the astonishing thing to me was to come to a village where the Eskimo aide was about 26, and because he wasn't old, he was therefore not to be as much respected as a person with more years, but he was a hunter, and he was a well-known hunter, and this made up for his age. The first time I went to the village, he and several men had just come back with a great brown bear which they had trussed up. It was dead. And they had trussed it up on a big frame. And he cut off one paw with its claws and handed it to me with the blood dripping, and this was a mark of great esteem, and there was nothing I could do except take it, and with this blood oozing over my gloves, and trying to keep from being as nauseated openly as I felt. And I could hardly wait to leave that village and then give this to one of the staff members, who was delighted to have it. But it was quite an experience, because I'm squeamish.
Well, but weren't you glad you were a pre-med student at one time?
Well, yes, but you see, it's all the blood that kept me. Was one reason probably I wouldn't have done well in that. It was a thrilling project.
Yeah, that was, and it made a real contribution. There's no question about that. Tell us about your involvement with the Cancer Society in California and your studies.
About 1960, I think it was, an oncologist in Los Angeles who was a member of the board of the California division, Robert McKenna, was complaining to them about the fact that he had some patients who had difficulty keeping a job, not because they weren't well enough, they were, but because employers were very leery of people with cancer. And he had encouraged patients to write to him and to the Cancer Society about their experiences. As a consequence of Bob McKenna's interest, a committee was set up in the California division, and I was asked to join that committee. It was chaired by Lester Breslow, who was then the Director of Public Health for the state of California. It had 6 oncologists and several other physicians. I was the only non-physician on the committee. And especially the radiologists really couldn't see any reason for dealing with the psychosocial aspects of cancer. As far as they were concerned, you took x-rays and you gave x-ray treatment, and that was it. Some of the other physicians were quite receptive, but really they didn't see, they thought because I was a social worker I was going to advocate only socialized medicine. In fact, one of them, when I made a report to the board of the Cancer Society, came right out and said that. And yet he worked in a medical school that was a public institution. And I think I won some of the others over by making a comment about that being more socialized than what we were trying to advocate, which was just have a study. They did appropriate some money. Lester Breslow actually made the presentation to the board, but had asked me to help because then we represented 2 disciplines. They did a survey of people who had cancer and found some of the problems that they had in getting jobs. And they made some use of that, but they could never get the American Cancer Society to express any interest because they were entirely focused on hard science and medicine, and these other aspects were of no interest to them. That's not where they wanted their money to go. In 1975, the division had some salary savings of approximately $10,000. I had chaired their statewide service committee for several years and had been on the board after that other study had been done in 1960. I guess I'd been almost continuously connected with them as a result of that earlier study. They asked if I would undertake a study with Al that would identify some of the problems that patients have in getting jobs. That what they wanted was a study of discrimination. We said we would undertake it if we could look at job experiences, whether positive or not, and if we could have freedom in how we use the money, because $10,000 clearly wasn't going to go very far. And we thought that its best use would be in hiring good interviewers. We were very lucky that the cancer surveillance program of the Comprehensive Cancer Center at USC, which is in the medical school, became interested and was willing to work with us because we were in a sister school in the university. And we were able to develop, I think, a good scientific study using a lot of volunteer help, but also paying for some of the interviewing. And we were able to develop a study that focused entirely on white collar because we didn't have enough money to go beyond that. It had a lot of complications in it because this was being started at a time when confidentiality was getting a great deal of protective attention, as it should. Doctors were being faced with malpractice suits and increased insurance, and they were very leery about talking to anyone about a patient. And in the middle of that study, Al died, and colleagues in the school pitched in and picked up the parts that he was doing. So we had a variety of barriers to deal with. Nevertheless, we were able to get very good material.
What date was this, roughly?
This study started in early 75, and we completed it in 76. We interviewed, what we had to do was to first get a count of the number of patients after we selected the kinds of sites that we would be interested in, the age limits, so that we were talking about employable people and whose employability was demonstrated by the fact that they were actually employed at the time the diagnosis was made. So we got counts by hospital from the Cancer Surveillance Center. Then we had to write to each hospital to get permission to draw the names. And sometimes, in almost every instance, I had to meet with a committee of the hospital. In one instance, there were as many as 7 committees, and this was very time-consuming. Then when we had permission, we could write to the doctor to explain what we were doing, to ask for permission to contact the patients. Some refused for a variety of reasons. Many were very cooperative. Then we had to write to the patient for permission. And by this time, you see, it's narrowing down in terms of numbers, but we still had a reasonable sample. So we interviewed patients. We interviewed a sample of employers. The actual employers, whether they had been positive or negative experiences, and sometimes we couldn't get permission to interview the employer. The patient was anxious about that. So we would take a similar kind of employer and see what their practices were. And we did an interview, a sample of interviews with doctors about what they told patients. That material worked out. It was a very productive study, and on the basis of that first study, California modified its Fair Employment Practices law, and several other states did also, and also turned attention to the insurance problem, because many of these people found their insurance was dropped. Now the Cancer Society was able to raise enough money so that we could do the next unit, which would be patterned on the first one, of blue-collar workers. I had been struck by the fact that among the white-collar workers, while about 20% of them belonged to unions, no one ever gave the union as a source of help, that they even had consulted the union. So in the blue-collar study, we did not only a sample of employers, but also a sample of unions. And so we had added that dimension. And then we also did a sample of doctors there. We then did a third study which dealt with youth who had been between the ages of 13 and 23 at the time of the diagnosis. Many of them were still in school. We found that they had problems in the school, Teachers separated them from other children, and problems, and also very positive.
That's because they were worried about contamination?
Yeah, for example, one 14-year-old boy with Hodgkin's disease returned to school, and the teacher put him in a desk by himself over by the window, where he would be surrounded by air which would take the germs away, and the other students would not be contaminated. With the youth study, we also interviewed a sample of school personnel, teachers, nurses, principals, as well as doctors and employers. So we had a variety of aspects of what was involved for these young people. And a lot of interesting things developed from it. Several organizations tried to replicate the study, but without success because they found it very difficult. They didn't have the same access we did through the cancer surveillance program. And we were patient. I was willing to start with the Children's Hospital, for example, 2 years before we were going to do the youth study and begin to go through the process of committees in order that when we were actually ready to begin, they were ready to let us begin. So it took a lot of careful working with them. And now the Children's Hospital, interestingly enough, is replicating a portion of the youth study program, study that we did. And they're doing it in tandem with Massachusetts General. They have each taken a group of 250 survivors and are looking at the kinds of work experiences and insurance experiences they've had. That will be ready probably by this next year. They found a lot of the same problems, even though they were their own patients that they were following up with. The studies are interesting too. I've been a consultant on the one here, not on Massachusetts, but in looking at the material here, I also see the Massachusetts material. And evidently the young people in Massachusetts have a less difficult time in getting established in work than the ones in California.
And that's still true. You found that in the other study too, didn't you?
That's right. That's right. So it's interesting that the pattern seems to persist, and now they're quite concerned at Children's Hospital about how do they interpret to doctors who often are the ones who say, well, this person, I can't tell you what the prognosis would be. Well, scientifically they can, but psychologically and socially they can. So it's interesting to see the efforts that are being made. There has been no real study of employability since ours, so that ours still stand as the primary source and are cited quite often. After the 3 major studies, I did do one kind of an offshoot when I was asked to do something for a special edition of Health published by Hayward Press. I block on their name. They were devoting a double issue to women and health. And I had been asked to write a piece about women and cancer, and I left it to write about women not only as patients but as caregivers and what their employment experiences are. So I went back to our original interviews where we had a number of caregivers. They were either their children or their husbands or a sibling, very often a parent-in-law of the women, and had quite lengthy interviews with 25 of them. 25 I could reach. I couldn't reach all of them. And I was very interested to find how often they reported having problems in the workplace, not just because they would be absent to take care of the person who was sick, but because they were viewed with some suspicion by fellow workers or employers because they were in contact with somebody with cancer. Less so when the patient was a child, but if it was an adult, then they faced some very difficult times. So we have a lot yet to do in that field. The last of those studies was finished in 1982. Not the caretakers.
Right.
That I did in 1986.
But my recollection is that they have been cited, and you mentioned that, very frequently and still continue to be cited. Because I run across citation. So they really have had an impact.
In 2 different years, I have participated in the American Cancer Society's annual seminar, which is to bring the latest data on cancer research to people in the news media. And the last one I was in 1986. They still had no other studies to use along this line. There have been some efforts also to do studies about insurance experiences. And in the middle 80s, I had a call from the Princeton, the Gallup people. They had decided to make a study. They knew that Mayo had done one. Mayo had followed up on a group of their own patients. And that wasn't hard. They could get the information from their own patients, but they couldn't get any information from the insurance companies. And so this Gallup poll was, and this was funded by the U.S. Labor Department. And it was the Labor Department that put the Gallup poll people in touch with me to find out how I had reached employers. And they had 1,000 insurance companies, and they had gotten responses from only 6. Well, I couldn't help them. They're very self-protective, and they just don't want to make any statements. But it shows how hard it is to get data. So that was the cancer.
Oh, good. That was another fascinating area. Let's see. There was. Now another part when we started earlier, we said we were going to talk about the industrial social work project, and what I neglected to include in that was the study that you did, TRW and the security personnel. USC in relation to the stress, mental distress and how they cope and what are some of the support systems, as I recall.
Yeah, as is, I think, pretty evident, my interest for a great many years from the time I started in social work was how people related to the idea of money and work. And this has been the theme through all of these things. In the early 60s, shortly after The Family in the Money World came out, I had begun to get calls from some of the industries, particularly, I don't think we mentioned this, from some of the industries who were having to lay off people because they had a policy that if there were 2 or 3, depending on the company, garnishments of wages, they had to fire the person. And they were losing some of their very good, highly experienced and trained personnel because they didn't recognize in early enough problems of over-expenditure that led to these, or the problems that would come up in marital discord and separation, where the wife would then garnish the husband's wages in order to get child support or alimony or whatever it might be. And as a result of those calls, I brought together a group of people in industry, personnel directors and industrial relations directors, identified not only from the calls that I had, but by Bob Doxson, who was then Dean of the School of Business, who had also been interested in this and had referred some of the calls to me. And we set up a committee which developed an institute for management on money management.
This was when?
This 1960, 61, and 62. We had 3 of them in 3 years.
Yes.
And the School of Business was involved with me in those. Those were aimed at management personnel to recognize some of the meanings of money to people and how they dealt with it, and to recognize some of the kinds of problems people had in dealing with it and what they could do to help these people through their personnel departments, however they did them in individual companies, or referring to voluntary agencies for help in order to counsel and try to avoid some of these situations. So we had 3 really very interesting money management institutes for management is what we called them. Then the year after those were over, Bob Doxson persuaded me to be part of a team for the John Hancock Company. Did you know about this?
I'm not sure.
The John Hancock Company had set up a series of meetings that they called seminars for breadwinners and homemakers. And they had a team of 4 women who went on 2 times a year to different cities in the country. And we did this for 5 years. One was a vice president of the John Hancock Company, and she would talk about the importance of insurance. One was Charlotte Montgomery, who was a writer for Good Housekeeping magazine, and she talked about the importance of planning, whether you're in the home or on the job. One was Julia Montgomery Walsh, who was the first woman member of the American Stock Exchange, who was had started life when she was widowed with 12 children as a probation officer in Seattle, had gone to the information service in the diplomatic corps overseas, was in Iron Curtain countries, and decided that she believed in capitalism. So she went to Harvard and got a master's in business administration, and became a stockbroker. She would talk to the women about the importance of their understanding and investing in equities. And my task, persuaded by Bob Doxson, was to deal with the related family questions that the participants would have. And they would have 200 women in each of these seminars. In the morning, we each made a presentation. The afternoon was devoted to answering questions. A lot of the questions that they asked me had to do with how to deal with their husband's work, or how to get into the workforce, and how to deal with problems in industry. These experiences, this long thread of experiences, starting with my own observation of people saying, I need only a loan, I'm going to be working again. Then the Money Management Institutes and these seminars had always convinced me that there had to be some place for social workers in industry. And there had been, of course, during World War II. But as soon as the war was over, there no longer was anything much being done about it. And I was very convinced that there was a role for social workers in industry. And that's really how I became involved in trying to get something set up here in the school. And this was also at the time when I had been putting supposedly half-time into working with the president and the executive vice president of the university. The president was retiring, and he said, "Now, what are you going to do with all the time you have left?" And I said, "What I'd like to do is focus on how do we get social workers and industry together." And his comment was, "Why should I look to industry? The university was a big employer, 10,000 employees. Why didn't I start here?" And that's how we got the impetus to start both our faculty staff counseling center and to move in the industrial social work activity. So my own interest grew out of these things I've been doing all those years.
But then you did that study on the...
Well, then we started the staff faculty counseling program with the expectation of some money from the university. And suddenly it wasn't available, so we were using volunteers to do the counseling. We'd been operating, and we started earlier than we might have, because Christmas was coming, and Christmas is always such a traumatic time for many people. We thought we ought to be on tap before.
What's this Christmas of?
This was Christmas of 1980. We'd been operating for about 3 days when I was waited upon by two people from the security office, a woman lieutenant and a man sergeant. And they said their security officers have a lot of problems, and could we do something special for them? They were a little uneasy about coming to the counseling service. Could we do some special training for them? And they described a number of instances of stress related to the kind of work they were doing, and they gave me some very graphic examples. I didn't know whether they really spoke just for themselves or for everybody, so I suggested that they each give me a group of 4 people, 1 line officers and 1 officer officers. And I would get some of our faculty to meet along with me with that each of those groups so we could see what kind of problems they had and then decide what we could do that would be geared to their particular needs. And that's what happened. I asked for volunteers from the faculty, and about 6 people came to each of those meetings. And we got a very good picture of the kinds of problems that they had and worked out a training program for them. But in the process of doing that, it seemed useful to identify what the mental health needs of security personnel were. I had meanwhile talked with some people at TRW and found similar problems to those of our security personnel. And as I had looked at the literature around the country, and I sent letters to every university that had a security department to get some idea of what the problems were that they had and how those differed between public and private universities, and then developed a study that would give us information. It was a study, and Patrick McCarthy, who was on our faculty at that time, was very interested, and he took a major part in designing this. And it consisted of several segments. One would be workshops of different kinds, so we could compare the findings at TRW and here at USC. He made a group of videotapes for dealing with stress, and one workshop, for example, in each locality would be to show those, to see what the officers could pick up without any discussion. Actually, that didn't work. Patrick had left by then and gone to Bryn Mawr, and so I picked those up, and I realized that the officers were interested both here and at TRW briefly, but if nobody talked with them, they became very bored. When the tape would end, then they wanted to talk. And so we revised that in order to have some showing of a tape, some discussion of the implications, showing of the tape, discussion, and then they were very successful. We tried to work out a workshop in each locality where the spouse would be present. That also didn't work out because you couldn't get them to come regularly. Spouses were working and they didn't want to come, but also the officers were too macho to share. And although we had some very skilled faculty conducting these, it was clear that it couldn't be done this way. So we had a lot of negative as well as positive learnings. We had a series of 10 workshops, 10 sessions in each workshop. At each place we had 5 workshops at SC, we had 5 at TRW. At SC they were not as receptive to them because there was a lot of problem between the different levels of staff which had not been resolved, and we couldn't do anything about those. Those were working conditions over which we could exercise no effect. At TRW, people were told to come, but they were paid for the time that they came. And if they didn't want to come, they didn't have to. But those were interesting sessions, and they were so interested that we had a follow-up workshop for those who wanted to continue there. Now, in each instance, we administered a group of tests before the workshop started, and then 4 weeks before. and then the week before, and then a month after the workshops. And this was just before the Olympics. We finished the last of the workshops 6 months before the Olympics, and we did another series of battery of tests immediately after the Olympics to see whether there was any continuity in improved performance. There was at TRW. It was not discernible here, again, because of the internal conflicts. And then they had some administrative changes here, which probably helped. But individuals at SC who early had not felt that they could come to a counseling session did begin to come. So quite a few of the SC personnel who were troubled used the workshops as the springboard to get to counseling. So that was, yeah. But we learned quite a lot about the mental health aspects, and although the workshops themselves were not very successful, the reasons they weren't, we were able to share with the administration, and that led to some of the changes. At TRW, they changed some of their orientation practices, and in some instances, they changed the way that troubled security officers could get help. Things like they would be expected to make an investigation of every room in a building. There were no special clothing for this, and yet they knew that during the day, all people working in those particular rooms, had to wear special clothing. So they'd be scared to death, and they didn't know what they were getting into. So this had to be dealt with. So there were a lot of management practices that got changed. Whether the security personnel ever realized how much change there was, I don't know, but it did result in some change. So it was interesting. Yeah, so it was a worthwhile project.
All right. I'd like to ask you a couple of summarizing, ending kinds of questions, like, as you think back over your career in social work, what would you say are some of the in California, major changes brought about that social work should be pleased with? You had something in which you might have had something to do with it. And what are some of the disappointments?
Well, there were a lot of changes that occurred, some of which I helped with, some of which Al helped with, and some where we both were involved.
Well, okay, let's take some of those.
They didn't always stick because political conditions.
No, but where you felt you had that you and or Al had an impact.
Well, I think we, for a while, were instrumental in changing some of the policies in public health and welfare and mental health, sometimes by fighting against something that was presented. For example, the new board of social welfare that had been appointed by Mr. Reagan had on it several people who had listened with great interest to what a legislator from Orange County proposed.